Encyclopedia paragraph 146. When more closely examined, what the aforesaid outward side of actuality implies is this: contingency, which is actuality in its immediacy, is the self identical, essentially only as a supposition which is no sooner made than it is revoked and leaves an existent externality. In this way, the external contingency is something presupposed, the immediate existence of which is at the same time a possibility and has the vocation to be suspended, to be the possibility of something else. Now, this possibility is the condition. A note: I am recording on Ray-Ban Stories by the Meta Facebook Corporation in partnership with Luxottica. They are Wayfarers smart glasses which record sound and video and also conveys it. The contingent, as the immediate actuality, is at the same time the possibility of somewhat else. No longer, however, that abstract possibility which we had at first, but the possibility which is, and a possibility existent is a condition. By the condition of a thing we mean first, an existence, in short, an immediate, and secondly, the vocation of this immediate to be suspended and subserve the actualizing of something else. Immediate actuality is in general as such never what it ought to be. It is a finite actuality with an inherent flaw, and its vocation is to be consumed. But the other aspect of actuality is its essentiality. This is primarily the inside which, as a mere possibility, is no less destined to be suspended. Possibility thus suspended is the issuing of a new actuality, of which the first immediate actuality was the presupposition. Here we see the alternation which is involved in the notion of a condition. The conditions of a thing seem at first sight to involve no bias anyway. Really, however, an immediate actuality of this kind includes in it the germ of something else altogether. At first, this something else is only a possibility, but the form of possibility is soon suspended and translated into actuality. This new actuality, thus issuing, is the very inside of the immediate actuality which it uses up. Thus there comes into being quite an other shape of things, and yet it is not an other, for the first actuality is only put as what it in essence was. The conditions which are sacrificed, which fall to the ground and are spent, only untie with themselves in the other actuality. Such, in general, is the nature of the process of actuality. The actual is no mere case of immediate being, but as essential being, a suspension of its own immediacy, and thereby mediating itself with itself. Encyclopedia paragraph 147, meta section gamma. When this externality of actuality is thus developed into a circle of the two categories of possibility and immediate actuality, showing the intermediation of the one by the other, it is what is called real possibility. Being such a circle, further, it is the totality and thus the content, the actual fact or affair in its all round definiteness. Whilst, in like manner, if we look at the distinction between the two characteristics in this unity, It realizes the concrete totality of the form, the immediate subtranslation of inner into outer, and of outer into inner. This self movement of the form is activity, carrying into effect the fact or affair as a real ground which is self suspended to actuality, and carrying into effect the contingent actuality, the conditions. In essence, it is their reflection in self and their self suspension to an other actuality, the actuality of the actual fact. If all the conditions are at hand, the fact, event, must be actual, and the fact itself is one of the conditions, for being in the first place only inner, it is at first itself only presupposed. Developed actuality as the coincident alternation of inner and outer, the alternation of their opposite motions combined into a single motion, is necessity. Necessity has been defined, and rightly so, as the union of possibility and actuality. This mode of expression, however, gives a superficial and therefore unintelligible description of the very difficult notion of necessity. It is difficult because it is the notion itself, only that its stages or factors are still as actualities, which are yet at the same time to be viewed as forms only, collapsing and transient. In the two following paragraphs, therefore, an exposition of the factors which constitute necessity must be given at greater length. When anything is said to be necessary, the first question we ask is, why? Anything necessary accordingly comes before us as something due to a supposition, the result of certain antecedents. If we go no further than mere derivation from antecedents, however, we have not gained a complete notion of what necessity means. What is merely derivative is what it is not through itself but through something else, and in this way it too is merely contingent. What is necessary, on the other hand, we would have to be what is necessary, on the other hand, would what is necessary, on the other hand, we would have to be what it is through itself. And thus, although derivative, it must still contain the antecedent whence it is derived as a vanishing element in itself. Hence, we say of what is necessary, it is. We thus hold it to be simple self relation in which all dependence on something else is removed. Necessity is often said to be blind, if that means that in the process of necessity, the end or final cause is not explicitly and overtly present, the statement is correct. The process of necessity begins with the existence of scattered circumstances which appear to have no interconnection and no concern one with another. These circumstances are an immediate actuality which collapses, and out of this negation a new actuality proceeds. Here we have a content which in point of form is doubled, once as content of the final realized fact, and once as content of the scattered circumstances, which appear as if they were positive, and make themselves at first felt in that character. The latter content is in itself not, and is accordingly inverted into its negative, thus becoming content of the realized fact. The immediate circumstances fall to the ground as conditions, but are at the same time retained as content of the ultimate reality. From such circumstances and conditions there has, as we say, proceeded quite another thing, and it is for that reason that we call this process of necessity blind. If, on the contrary, we consider teleology, if, on the contrary, we consider teleological action and teleology from the Oxford American Dictionary, the first definition from philosophy, the explanation of phenomena by the purpose they serve rather than by postulated causes, and the second definition from philosophy and theology, the doctrine of design and purpose in the material world. If, on the contrary, we consider teleological action, we have in the end of action a content which is already foreknown. This activity, therefore, is not blind, but seeing. To say that the world is ruled by providence implies that design, as what has been absolutely predetermined, is the active principle, so that the issue corresponds to what has been foreknown and forewilled. The theory, however, which regards the world as determined through necessity and the belief in a divine providence are by no means mutually excluding points of view. The intellectual principle underlying the idea of divine providence will hereafter be shown to be the notion. But the notion is the truth of necessity, which it contains in suspension in itself, just as conversely, necessity is the notion implicit. Necessity is blind only so long as it is not understood. There is nothing, therefore, more mistaken than the charge of blind fatalism made against the philosophy of history. When it takes for its problem to understand the necessity of every event, the philosophy of history, rightly understood, takes the rank of a theodicy, and thus who fancy they honor divine providence by excluding necessity from it are really degrading it by this exclusiveness to a blind and irrational caprice. In the simple language of the religious mind, which speaks of God's eternal and immutable decrees, there is implied an express recognition that necessity forms part of the essence of God. In his difference from God, man with his own private opinion and will follows the call of caprice and arbitrary humor, and thus often finds his acts turn out something quite different from what he had meant and willed. But God knows what he wills, is determined in his eternal will, neither by accident from within nor from without, and what he wills, he also accomplishes irresistibly. So mote it be. Necessity gives a point of view which has important bearings upon our sentiments and behavior. When we look upon events as necessary, our situation seems at first sight to lack freedom completely. In the creed of the ancients, as we know, necessity figured as destiny. The modern point of view, on the contrary, is that of consolation. And consolation means that if we renounce our aims and interests, we do so only in prospect of receiving compensation. Destiny, on the contrary, leaves no room for consolation, but a close examination of the ancient feeling about destiny will not by any means reveal a sense of bondage to its power. Rather, the reverse. This will clearly appear if we remember that the sense of bondage springs from inability to surmount the antithesis, and from looking at what is and what happens as contradictory to what ought to be and happen. In the ancient mind, the feeling was more of the following kind: because such a thing is, it is, and as it is, so ought it to be. Here there is no contrast to be seen, and therefore no sense of bondage, no pain, and no sorrow. True indeed, as already remarked, this attitude towards destiny is void of consolation, but then, on the other hand, it is a frame of mind which does not need consolation, so long as personal subjectivity has not acquired its infinite significance. It is this point on which special stress should be laid in comparing the ancient sentiment with that of the modern and Christian world. By subjectivity, however, we may understand, in the first place, only the natural and finite subjectivity with its contingent and arbitrary content of private interests and inclinations, all in short, that we call person as distinguished from thing. taking thing in the emphatic sense of the word, in which we use the correct expression that it is a question of things and not of persons. In this sense of subactivity, we cannot help admiring the tranquil resignation of the ancients to destiny, and feeling that it is a much higher and worthier mood than that of the moderns, who obstinately pursue their subjective aims, and when they find themselves constrained to resign the hope of reaching them, console themselves with the prospect of a reward in some other shape. But the term subjectivity is not to be confined merely to the bad and finite kind of it which is contrasted with the thing, fact. In its truth, subjectivity is immanent in the fact, and as a subjectivity thus infinite is the very truth of the fact. Thus regarded, the doctrine of consolation receives a newer and a higher significance. It is in this sense that the Christian religion is to be regarded as the religion of consolation, and even of absolute consolation. Christianity, we know, teaches that God wishes all men to be saved. That teaching declares that subjectivity has an infinite value, and that consoling power of Christianity just lies in the fact that God Himself is in it known as the absolute subjectivity, so that inasmuch as subjectivity involves the element of particularity, our particular personality, too, is recognized not merely as something to be solely and simply nullified, but as at the same time something to be preserved. The gods of the ancient world were also, it is true, looked upon as personal, but the personality of a Zeus and an Apollo is not a real personality, it is only a figure in the mind. In other words, these gods are mere personifications, which, being such, do not know themselves and are only known. An evidence of this defect and this powerlessness of the old gods is found even in the religious beliefs of antiquity. In the ancient creeds, not only men, but even gods were represented as subject to destiny.
Pepromenon.
Pepromenon, defined by Google Translate as destiny, or
Imarmeni.
Imarmeni, defined as impregnable. Impregnable. So, a moment to explain something about what Hegel is doing here. So, destiny or something impregnable. Uh, the Greek gods were electromagnetic frequencies, or are electromagnetic frequencies that prefer certain vessels. In the case of Zeus, he prefers the vessel of a king or an emperor. So you would say, for instance, uh, Julius Caesar, who was the uh, priest of Zeus, or the priest of Jupiter, in Rome, was said to actually be Zeus himself, or Jupiter himself, and his body was imbued with the electromagnetism of Zeus. And so he himself was not Zeus, unless you're monophysite. He was the place where Zeus was held. For instance, so because there's a story of one of the earthly wives of Zeus, or I should call her one of the earthly uh, mistresses of Zeus. It was very important for Zeus to produce as many heirs as possible, and his wife, the Divine Mother Hera, did not prefer uh, physical encounters with her husband. And so they are known to have children. One of them is called Ganymede. He also had a body upon earth, which was withdrawn to heaven. So and in the case of Apollo, his electromagnetism tends to fall upon a woman who is called the Pythia. Usually, the Pythia was found at uh, well, I'm forgetting her place at the moment, but a place in Greece where men would go, and anyone would go to seek her advice. Delphi, she was the Oracle of Delphi. You would go there. She was imbued with being Apollo, but called the Pythia, and she, for many, many years, was consulted for legal concerns. When the electromagnetism of Apollo falls in a male body, it tends to be a philosopher or a philosopher king, but not necessarily a king. And then he is called uh, the Apollo of his location. So, one version of this Apollo that we know is Pythagoras, who was called the Hyperborean Apollo. Hyperborea, even though he was based in Italy and he came from what is now Syria or the border of Syria and Turkey, I believe Hyperborea is still considered Switzerland, where you'll find CERN today. CERN, which operates the Large Hadron Collider or atom smasher, um, does a lot more than that. But in that doing, it creates a lot of information and knowledge. The Temple of Apollo is at the center of the ring that goes around and around, where you'll also find a statue of Shiva in his form of the destroyer and restorer. And so these entities, the Greek gods, were electromagnetic and they could be found in different vessels, human or statue or otherwise, some part of their receptive character. Whereas in Christianity, God is extremely personal and held at least in an aspect of him, or a derivative of himself, in the person of Jesus Christ. But in reality, God, the Father, is held completely electromagnetic and away from people, though because it's electromagnetism and a radio wave, he is able to communicate with certain individuals directly. And so they're not God when they receive his message. They are vessels or prophets for God. So a man doesn't take on father godness in Christianity. And only one man took on sonship, which was in the form of Jesus Christ. Uh, Whereas in the other traditions, a man could become the earthly vessel of Zeus, or maybe more than one, and also Hera may have a queen upon the earth that represents her, or she may be one of the Vestal virgins, and their son Ganymede, who's called the wine bearer, and they may have other sons as well. Uh, One of them is called Hephaestus, though whether or not they're different or at different times is a concern there. So just be aware that what Hegel is doing is what's called the Hobbes bargain. A Hobb is a an elemental whose majority characteristic was in materialism or the earth. Someone who a physicist today, and he is in his own way a mythological character that's respected and known. And his job is to find a way to uh, honor the entities, the electromagnetic realities of the forest. So some people will call those pagan entities, without overstepping the one God, which is electromagnetism itself. And so, how do you parse out these entities and ensure that you haven't overstepped your bounds with the Church of the One God, the Catholic Church, for instance. And this is the Hobbes bargain. And so Hegel is here, engaged in the Hobbes bargain of discussing the Greek entities as non material, except that they take vessels. And so I'm explaining it a bit further. Okay. In the ancient creeds, not only men, but even gods are represented as subject to destiny, whether it be destiny or an impregnable uh, outcome, that they just can't overcome it. A destiny which we must conceive as necessity, not unveiled, and thus as something wholly impersonal, selfless, and blind. On the other hand, the Christian God is God, not known merely, but also self knowing. He is a personality not merely figured in our minds, but rather absolutely actual. So it could be that a vessel of Zeus or Apollo may not be aware that they are a vessel of Zeus or Apollo, but the Christian God, the electromagnetism itself, if you will, uh, can be known and knows itself. So it is always aware of its status and what it is. Rarely will you find that in a human form. So this doctrine allows us to say God is, but is not in a current human form. So no man or woman walks out and claims to be God. They must always meet the standard of self knowledge and offering knowledge of self, which is difficult for humanity and separates us in some ways from the divine. Even the Greek gods or the royalty or the very high ones must also engage this process of self knowledge, whereas God does not. We must refer to the philosophy of religion for a further discussion of the points here touched, but we may note in passing how important it is for any man to meet everything that befalls him with the spirit of the old proverb which describes each man as the architect of his own fortune. That means that it is only himself, after all, of which a man has the usufruct. Uh, Usufruct, a noun from Roman law, the right to enjoy the use and advantages of another's property, short of the destruction or waste of its substance. So the prophet Joseph uh, had the usufruct of the Egyptian king. He was able to do, he had the right to enjoy the use and advantages of being king of Egypt, short of holding the title king and the destruction or waste of its substance. The other way would be to lay the blame of whatever we experience upon other men, upon unfavorable circumstances, and the like, and this is a fresh example of the language of unfreedom. And at the same time the spring of discontent. If man saw, on the contrary, that whatever happens to him is only the outcome of himself, and that he only bears his own guilt, he would stand free, and in everything that came upon him would have the consciousness that he suffered no wrong. A man who lives in this peace with himself and his lot commits much that is perverse and amiss, for no other reason than because of the false opinion that he is wronged by others. No doubt, too, there is a great deal of chance in what befalls us, but the chance has its root in the natural man. So long, however, as a man is otherwise conscious that he is free, his harmony of soul and peace of mind will not be destroyed by the disagreeables that befall him. It is their view of necessity, therefore, which is at the root of the content and discontent, or content and discontent of men, and which in that way determines their destiny itself. Encyclopedia paragraph 148. Among the three elements in the process of necessity, the condition, the fact and the activity. Infrasection A, the condition is alpha, what is presupposed or antestated. In essence, it is not only supposed or stated, and so not only correlative to the fact, but also prior and so independent, a contingent and external circumstance which exists without respect to the fact. While thus contingent, however, this presupposed or antestated term in respect withal of the fact which is the totality, is a complete circle of conditions. Beta, the conditions are passive, are used as materials for the fact, into the content of which they thus enter. They are likewise intrinsically conformable to this content and already contain its whole characteristic. Intersection beta, intersection B, the fact is alpha, so the fact we're defining now the fact is also alpha, something presupposed or antestated. In essence, it is at first and as supposed only inner and possible, and also being prior and independent content by itself. Beta, by using up the conditions, it receives its external existence, the realization of the articles of its content, which reciprocally correspond to the conditions, so that whilst it presents itself out of these as the fact, it also proceeds from them. Intersection C, the activity similarly has alpha, an independent existence of its own as a man, a character, and at the same time it is possible only where the conditions are and the fact. Beta, it is the movement which translates the conditions into fact, and the latter into former as the side of existence, or rather the movement which induces the fact from the conditions in which it is potentially present, and which gives existence to the fact by abolishing the existence possessed by the conditions. Insofar as these three elements stand to each other in the shape of independent existences, this process has the aspect of an outward necessity. Outward necessity has a limited content for its fact. For the fact is this whole in phase of singleness, but since in its form this whole is external to itself, it is self externalized even in its own self and in its content, and this externality attaching to the fact is a limit of its content. Encyclopedia paragraph 149. Necessity then is potentially the one essence, self same but now full of content, in the reflected light of which its distinction in the reflected light of which its distinctions take the form of independent realities. This self-sameness is at the same time as absolute form, the activity which reduces its dependency and mediates into immediacy. Whatever is necessary is through another, which is broken up into the mediating ground, the fact and the activity, and an immediate actuality or accidental circumstance, which is at the same time a condition. The necessary, being through an other, is not in and for itself. Hypothetical, it is a mere result of assumption. But this intermediation is just as immediately, however, the abrogation of itself. The ground and contingent condition is translated into immediacy, by which that dependency is now lifted up into actuality, and the fact has closed with itself. In this return to itself, the necessary simply and positively is, as unconditioned actuality. The necessary is so mediated through a circle of circumstances. It is so because the circumstances are so, and at the same time, it is so unmediated. It is so because it is. Hegel, Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Section 1, Logic, the Science of the Idea in and for itself, Chapter 8, Second Subdivision of Logic, the Doctrine of Essence, Quasi-Subdivision C, Actuality, Infra-Subdivision A, Relationship of Substantiality. Encyclopedia, paragraph 150. The necessary is in itself an absolute correlation of elements. In essence, the process developed in the preceding paragraphs, in which the correlation also suspends itself to absolute identity. In its immediate form, it is the relationship of substance and accident. The absolute self identity of this relationship is substance as such, which, as necessity, gives the negative to this form of inwardness, and thus invests itself with actuality, but which also gives the negative to this outward thing. In this negativity, the actual, as immediate, is only an accidental, which through this bare possibility passes over into another actuality. This transition is the identity of substance, regarded as form activity. See Encyclopedia paragraphs 148 and 149. Encyclopedia paragraph 151. Substance is accordingly the totality of the accidents, revealing itself in them as their absolute negativity, that is to say, as absolute power, and at the same time as the wealth of all content. This content, however, is nothing but that very revelation, since the character being reflected in itself to make content is only a passing stage of the form which passes away in the power of substance. Substantiality is the absolute form activity and the power of necessity. All content is but a vanishing element which merely belongs to this process, where there is an absolute revulsion of form and content into one another. In the history of philosophy, we meet with substance as the principle of Spinoza's system. On the import and value of that much praised and no less decried philosophy, there has been great misunderstanding and a deal of talking since the days of Spinoza. The atheism and, as a further charge, the pantheism of the system has formed the commonest ground of accusation. These cries arise because of Spinoza's conception of God as substance and substance only. What we are to think of this charge follows, in the first instance, from the place which substance takes in the system of the logical idea. Though an essential stage in the evolution of the idea, substance is not the same with absolute idea, but the idea under the still limited form of necessity. It is true that God is necessity, or as we may also put it, that he is the absolute thing. He is, however, no less the absolute person. That he is the absolute person, however, is a point which the philosophy of Spinoza never reached. And on that side, it falls short of the true notion of God, which forms the content of religious consciousness in Christianity. Spinoza was by descent a Jew, and it is upon the whole the Oriental way of seeing things, according to which the nature of the finite world seems frail and transient, that has found its intellectual expression in his system. This Oriental view of the unity of substance certainly gives the basis for all real further development. Still, it is not the final idea. It is marked by the absence of the principle of the Western world, the principle of individuality, which first appeared under a philosophic shape contemporaneously with Spinoza in the monadology of Leibniz. So, to say someone is a Jew is to place them in their ethnicity, and to say that Judaism, comes from the Orient is also a statement of fact. In the Orient, the physical world, including in Buddhism, is transient and less important than the absolute. So, God is an absolute figure. And one thing I will take away from Hegel from this, though, if you read at least the explanations of the Torah, I am a Jew by ethnicity, by birth, and then I have a Catholic confirmation. If you read the Torah, and really have the additional commentary on it. There's a commentary by a Frenchman who is Rabbi Shlomo Itzaki, or called Rashi. If you read his 900-year-old commentary, you will see that the God of Israel, or at least the Lord of Israel, took a form and spoke to Moses face to face. And then also that Lord mentioned a non-transient deity as its source. He said, "I am that I am." So there is a concept of a God someone could see face to face, but that was not the case of the majority of Israel. They saw a cloud or a mist in which God was perceived to be there as well. And so his reality to the majority of Israel, of the tribes of Israel following Moses, and the tribes of Moses following him in the deserts, or well, in the sometimes lush areas of the Sinai Peninsula. Only to Moses was God immediate in his face and spoke to him as a friend. Sometimes uh, his brother Aaron would see an angel uh, other than the one that Moses was speaking with. But the majority of Israel saw a mist or a cloud that they understood to be God, and have its reference. So uh, for an elite, God is material, and for a sub elite extending from him, he is at least materializing in a cloud, or if you want an electromagnetic field. And so these are the overwhelming teaching is the non relatedness of that deity. But because many religions, Christianity and Islam, have their extensions from Judaism, uh, the what Moses experienced was considered the better opportunity, and so they went toward a Lord Adonai, or a God you could see, in the person of uh, in the person of Jesus Christ, and possibly in relation to Mary in the person of the Archangel Gabriel. But also, from an Islamic standpoint, they kind of meld the two. You had the Archangel Gabriel talking to the semi divine person, Muhammad, about a God that has many attributes, but did not materialize except by reference to his actions. So whether or not he was contiguous or coterminous with his actions is that debate. So monadology by Leibniz is closer to Christianity than are Judaism and Islam, but that's the continuation there. To some, to Moses, you can see God face to face. To Isaac, you can see him face to face and wrestle with him. But for Israel, he was a cloud. All right, so moving on. From this point, we glance back to the alleged atheism of Spinoza. The charge will be seen to be unfounded if we remember that his system, instead of denying God, rather recognizes that he alone really is. So the theology of that believes that man has a necessary role in the cosmos is the one that he would be an atheist of, not an atheist of God. So theism is a belief system, and atheism is to be without a belief system. Because Spinoza was a Jew and therefore a Jewish theist, pardon, a Judean or a Jew, Jewish theist, he was also a man atheist or a humanist atheist in that process. So his atheism would have come in worshiping man, not in worshiping God, though I wonder if it was that simple. Nor can it be maintained that the God of Spinoza, although he is described as alone true, is not the true God, and therefore as God, and nor can it be maintained that the God of Spinoza, although he is described as alone true, is not the true God, and therefore as good as no God. If that were a just charge, it would only prove that all other systems, where speculation has not gone beyond a subordinate stage of the idea that the Jews and Mohammedans, who know God only as the Lord, and that even the many Christians for whom God is merely the most high, unknowable, and transcendent being, are as much atheists as Spinoza. The so called atheism of Spinoza is merely an exaggeration of the fact that he defrauds the principle of difference or finitude of its due. Hence, his system, as it holds that there is properly speaking no world, at any rate that the world has no positive being, should rather be styled a cosmism. These considerations will also show that these considerations will also show what is to be said of the charge of pantheism. If pantheism means, as it often does, the doctrine which takes finite things in their finitude and in the complex of them to be God, we must acquit the system of Spinoza of the crime of pantheism. For in that system, finite things in the world as a whole are denied all truth. On the other hand, the philosophy of acosmism is for that reason certainly pantheistic. The shortcoming thus acknowledged to attach to the content turns out at the same time to be a shortcoming in respect of form. Spinoza puts substance at the head of his system and defines it to be the unity of thought and extension, without demonstrating how he gets to this distinction or how he traces it back to the unity of substance. The further treatment of the subject proceeds in what is called the mathematical method. Definitions and axioms are first laid down. After them comes a series of theorems, which are proved by an analytical reduction of them to these unproved postulates. Although the system of Spinoza, and that even by those who altogether reject its contents and results, is praised for the strict sequence of its method, such unqualified praise of the form is as little justified as an unqualified rejection of the content. The defect of the content is that the form is not known as immanent in it, and therefore only approaches it as an outer and subjective form, and intuitively accepted by Spinoza without a previous mediation by dialectic. Substance, as the universal negative power, is as it were a dark, shapeless abyss, which engulfs all definite content as radically null, and produces from itself nothing that has a positive subsistence of its own. Encyclopedia paragraph 152, at the stage where substance as absolute power is self-relating power, itself a merely inner possibility, which thus determines itself to accidentality, from which power the externality it thereby creates is distinguished. Necessity is a correlation strictly so called, just as in the first form of necessity it is substance. This is the correlation of causality.